Hello, everyone. Welcome to part 2 of our lecture. For today, we're tracing the use of the Dies Irae through history. The first composer that we're going to stop into, listen, and sort of investigate his work is going to be Berlioz, Hector Berlioz. He was one of the principal composers of the Romantic era, who is known for his programmatic works. One of the pieces that I would have put in within our Tone Poems and Program Symphonies lecture is this piece, but saved it because it does indeed use the Dies Irae. So as we recall, the Romantic era was particular because composers were very interested in the idea of musical storytelling. So what story does this piece tell? Well, Hector Berlioz happened to have a little bit too much opium one evening and had a very fantastic sort of dream, and then wrote a multi-movement symphonic form based on this opium dream that he had. He had a pretty big crush on this lady who has a pretty leading role within the symphony. Her melody, the beloved melody, is something he called an Irae fixe. And that is a melody that is a point of obsession. And her melody, it's kind of similar to a leitmotif, a melody that represents a person, place, character, idea, or situation. And her melody is woven in through each of the 5 movements. For those of you who are like, 5 movements, that's a little strange. Yes, it is. The typical symphonic form is indeed 4 movements. So this is a manipulation of a traditional form, which Romantic era composers were very famous for doing. We're going to drop into the 5th movement, which is a dream at a witch's Sabbath. So let's backtrack because that's pretty dark. What happens in the first through 3rd movements is sort of bland as compared to what happens in the 4th and the 5th movement. Movements 1 through 3 are very beautiful. We get to hear the beloved melody, the Irae fixe, and it comes in 3 different kind of settings. The dream, because it is indeed opium induced, becomes weirder and stranger. The movements that I generally enjoy and am most concerned about are the 4th and 5th movements, where things start to go awry. So in the 4th movement, we drop into a sort of celebratory feel. And what are we celebrating? Well, we are going to watch someone get beheaded. And it's none other than Berlioz, who's one of the characters that where he has a melody himself. He is chasing his love interest essentially through movements 1 through 3, is actually the subject of a beheading in movement number 4. So what we do is we hear a march to the scaffold. There's a big drum roll. We have an orchestrated slice of a blade followed by a thunk, which is the head rolling down a set of stairs, and then bam, we're in the 5th movement, which is where we're going to concern ourselves. So where are we? Probably in hell. And more specifically, we are at a witch's Sabbath. And what's happening at a witch's Sabbath? Well, nothing particularly good. We hear the beloved melody, but it's grotesque and strange. And we hear the funeral bells by the church, but otherwise it is a diabolical orgy of sorts where everything sounds rather cacophonous and rather macabre as well. Of course, because we are trying to illustrate our descent to hell, we're going to quote the Dies Irae, which happens, I don't know, about 5 or so minutes in throughout the piece. I'll let you know with a little bit of a hand wave when the Dies Irae shows up. It happens with the brass section with some big church bells in the background. But why don't we go ahead and take a listen, and then we'll go ahead and review some of the things that makes this a particularly Romantic era piece, in addition to sort of making note of where the Dies Irae shows up. If you need to, this would be a good time to review the DS Irae, but we're listening for this ba ba dee da dee da dee da sort of cascading melodic line. Like I said, it appears in the brass family first, so I'll give you a hand wave when we finally listen to it. Lots of changes in meter, lots of extended techniques. It's going to be a very wild ride. So let's go ahead and listen. Hold on. Give me one moment. Wanted to make sure that you can hear the audio appropriately. Everything's good. Okay, the piece is a little bit longer, but that's the end of the Dies Irae quotation. Hopefully you noticed that I threw up my fingers a couple of times. So remember we talked about the first phrase of the Dies Irae. That's the thing that's most quoted. Notice that we had it at a slower tempo. So the first phrase took a lot longer for us to listen to than the Gregorian chant version, but was often followed by the second phrase. We did also hear the third and the fourth phrase as we heard in the Gregorian chant version, but that's not as often covered by composers. In this case, we only heard it one time. What we heard more often is the first and the second phrases happening in like a sort of slower tempo and then a sort of faster tempo, or a half time and a double time feel. So other things that we heard here beyond the Dies Irae, we obviously have a rather large orchestra. It's huge. There's a ton of string instruments that are part of this ensemble, not to mention a huge brass section and a woodwind section that involves a lot of secondary instruments. We also heard a number of things that are giveaways from the Romantic era. One of them is inconsistency in meter. We heard a lot of different time signatures within this particular excerpt. A lot of pushing and pulling of time, rubato, rallentandos, accelerandos, etc. We also heard lots of extended techniques using instruments in non-traditional ways. We had some pizzicato. We had some pitch bending in some of the woodwind instruments. Again, this is in the Romantic era. We hear a lot more sort of radical extended techniques in the later part of the era and into the 20th century, but they are certainly present here. Not to mention that the music feels fairly cinematic in quality. Good. We're going to listen to one other example as a part of this second segment, and that is within the scope of cinema. Stanley Kubrick, who is a film maker and director rather, that I very much admire his work, has a very particular and interesting score assembly method that he used within the film The Shining. Most iconic of The Shining is perhaps the opening credits sequence, which does indeed use a strong and very recognizable quotation of the Dies Irae. We're going to notice that our landscape is particularly vast. And one of the things that makes the opening particularly unsettling is the use of extended techniques and strange vocal effects that are happening within, or rather against the synthesized part that is playing the Dies Irae. So we hear lots of pitch bending, lots of sort of things that disorient us to what is happening within the combination of the visuals, which seem very calm, and the accompanying score, which seems very haunted. Let's go ahead and listen to the opening credits of The Shining. the opening credit sequence is really important to sort of predisposing us to the genre of the film in the first place. And what we have here is a very recognizable, without any sort of frills or any major alterations to it, a direct quote of the Dies Irae. That's followed and kind of accompanied with these very strange and disorienting banshee sounds. They are kind of somewhat vocal in quality. They obviously use a lot of extended techniques, perhaps a flexitone that's being bowed, but instruments being used in non-traditional ways in addition to being tampered with electronically. We also have something that happens in time and then something that stops happening in time. It feels very disorienting to go from one to the other. Not to mention that all of the music that we're listening to does not match the visuals or the sort of tranquility of the scene that we're viewing as the audience. So that's one way in which Kubrick is able to create effective drama, is by combining music that kind of works against the image of the scene. There are a number of other very interesting musical cues that are used here, but the Dies Irae makes a very recognizable entrance to this film that is worth making note of. So something that Kubrick obviously thought was iconic enough to use as the very introduction to his cinematic creation. In any event, we're going to look at the Dies Irae in 4 other contexts in part 3 and 4. Let me pull up my lecture notes just to make sure I didn't miss anything for these 2 examples. Okay, here we are back to my lecture notes. So the lecture notes sort of reinforce the programmatic details of Symphonie Fantastique. We listened to, of course, movement number 5, which is Dreams of a Witch's Sabbath. The date there, 1830. So on the earlier side of the Romantic, well, sort of like mid part of the Romantic era. But we hear romantic tendencies in music for another strong 70 plus years. So we would push the envelope a little bit further when it came to manipulating the traditional form of the symphony, including extended techniques, etc. Wendy Carlos is the composer for the opening to The Shining, which of course was created in 1980. Very really iconic film if you have not seen it, from Kubrick's collection of works. As we noticed, there was a really strong quotation of the Dies Irae, followed by a lot of synthesized sounds that incorporated lots of rubato and extended techniques. So when we come back for part 3, we'll listen to a quotation of the Dies Irae in 2 other programmatic contexts. One for Stephen Sondheim's musical Sweeney Todd, of course, the Demon Barber of Fleet Street, followed by Michael Dougherty, who wrote a rather ridiculous piece of concert music called Dead Elvis in the 90s. So we'll listen to that as well before returning to the Romantic era, because those composers were very fond of listening, or rather quoting pieces that incorporated the idea of death. So I will see you guys back for part 3 shortly.